Señores y señoras, colegas, ladies and gentlemen, antes de todo quiero agradecer la invitación de venir aquí en Chile. Es mi primera vez en Chile. Ya conozco un poco Argentina, Perú, Bolivia, pero en Chile es mi primera vez. Y hace tiempo que esperaba una ocasión, una oportunidad de viajar aquí para descubrir un poco de este país. So I would like to, first of all, express my deep thanks to the British Council and to the organizers of this conference for inviting me here. First of all, because it is an opportunity to meet new people and discuss interesting things, which I will get to in a second. But also, as I said, a dream that I had been harboring for a while, which finally comes true. I mean, there are some family connections for me to Chile that date back to the 19th century. And that's why I was quite curious to come down here and see a little bit of the country. But that's another story. The story that brings us together today is one which is probably more complicated than it seems. If I go back one slide and talk about, look, language and development, I think there is something wrong with this title. And my message is that the real title should be Languages and Development. This is going to be the gist of my argument. We should think about language in a plural perspective, which is why when I talk about language and development with language in the singular, I will try to provide a general introduction into this, but also a few critical considerations, which I hope will bring us to a wider perspective on the role of language, individual languages, and languages as, in general, languages in their plurality, their role in economic development and well-being. So one problem with when we talk about language and development is that it's what I call the temptation of cliches. A very famous author, Mr. Kaplan, who's American, who's now retired, has written a book about language policy published in 1997 together with Mr. Baldauf. And the first, I think the opening sentence of their book is that they say, well, problem is with language. Language is like sex. Everybody does it, so everybody's an expert. The problem is with this that, lots of ideas are going around, and some of the ideas are very tempting, but they can be misleading. They can be misleading because they are cliches. And I would like to start with a quote that I believe I shared in one of the very first exchanges of messages I had. Was it with John Nag? Was it with one of the other? I don't remember with whom it was, but I remember that at some point I quoted this, which comes from a prof that I had the privilege to work with in Seattle. Language is a subject about which experts and lay people alike seem to hold extraordinarily stubborn beliefs. We all have stubborn beliefs about language. We all are experts about language. Some of you work in education management, and you also know the same thing happens with schools and education. In schools and education, since everybody has been through school at some point, everybody knows exactly how the school system should be organized and what teachers should be doing, right? So about language, we have a little bit of the same phenomenon. It is so pervasive that everybody has opinions, and very often these opinions are extraordinarily stubborn, and they have the status not of knowledge-based information, but of beliefs. And this affects lay people, it affects experts as well, which is why I believe it is so important to have opportunities such as today, where we can discuss things and confront ideas, possibly disagree, but what I find interesting about disagreement is to spot the origin, the source of the disagreement, and this is where we get to real scientific business with its policy implications. This is where issues can turn from matters of opinion and belief to empirical things that we can test, that we can examine in a more cool-headed way. So the menu for today is starting out with this observations that many beliefs are based on cliches, which turn up all over the place. In media, sometimes a political discourse, sometimes even academic discourse, particularly when we talk about this language economics connection. So the first thing I would like to do is to look at these set of connections in general. Then I will focus on the specific issue of the value of language. Value is an important term because if we're talking about prosperity, prosperity comes from value creation. And then I will, as I said, suggest a shift in emphasis, or if you would like, a broadening of the emphasis from the notion of language X or language Y or language Z for prosperity to multilingualism for prosperity. What I'm going to be saying about the English language, I could say about any dominant language. I would say the exact same thing if the language currently in a position of major global influence were my native French, or if it were Mandarin Chinese or Putonghua, as may happen 20 or 30 years from now, or if it were Spanish, which is, as the ambassador has aptly reminded us of, is a world language as well. So no matter what language, I think we have to step back a little bit and move from the idea of this language or that language to the combination of languages as a condition for prosperity. I like to think in terms of takeaway for the audience. What do I hope you will perhaps remember from this morning's lecture? Is essentially three things. First thing would be a familiarity with the basics of language economics, or the economics of language, or the economics of languages, which is a field of research in its own right. So I'd like you to, first of all, leave this lecture with an idea that, hey, there is this field of research called language economics, and this is roughly what it's about. First thing. Second thing, a few facts and figures about the value of language, of English, of the English language as such, and the value of multilingualism. And then perhaps more fundamentally, some tools that you can use to spot in public discourse or in academic discourse, to spot stubborn beliefs and question them. Question these stubborn beliefs that are so pervasive that have to do with these visions of the role of languages in economic and social life. So that's what I would like to do today. That's what I hope you will get from this lecture. There are many things that I will not have the time to address during the lecture proper, but then, of course, we can do this during the roundtable afterwards. So, some basics of language economics, also known as the economics of language, usually in the singular. The term economics of languages has never quite caught on, so language economics is probably the most compact way to talk about it. Now, it is a fairly marginal field of specialization in the economics discipline. Some of you, I imagine, may have been trained in economics, and you know that economics, regrettably, has become fairly insular in its way of looking at the world. So very insular, sometimes very self-righteous. The interesting thing about language economics is that it is better this way? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Language economics forces us to think in an interdisciplinary way. And I think this interdisciplinarity is part of the reason why it has gained a bit of recognition, a bit of respectability since the beginnings of language economics in the 1960s. The very notion that you can think about language from an economic perspective is in and of itself not so obvious. For many people, there is something sacrilegious about it, in the sense that something just quite as ineffable as language. Language has to do with culture, has to do with identity, as has been said this morning. And therefore, talking about it from an economic perspective sounds horribly mundane. So the very idea that you can respectfully talk about language from an economic perspective is not obvious in and of itself. But anyway, it has evolved from what used to be a completely fringe interest with a very narrow focus or, specific disconnected focuses. It has become a widening research field with strong interdisciplinary connections, in particular, of course, with the language disciplines, also with the education sciences, particularly language education, with sociology, political science, political philosophy. These are people that we work with not on a daily basis, but almost, with law, in particular constitutional law, minority rights, human rights, and also with international relations and history. Language economics nowadays is an increasingly open and interdisciplinary field. And if I wanted to single out the most important features of the discipline, or the specialization, perhaps I should say, would be the two following ones. The first is that language economics, or economics of language, is rooted in the very core, in the very heart of economics as a discipline. The question we have to perhaps start out from there, is what is economics ultimately about? If you ask first-year students, what is economics about? They're going to tell you it's about production or the market or consumption or prices or the interest rate or the inflation rate, things like that. Well, yes, but these are only parts of it. Economics fundamentally is about making choices. The best definition of economics was due to, in my opinion, to Lionel Robbins, who was commissioned by the British government to do a report in the early 1930s on what economics is. And he said economics is a science that studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means that have alternative uses. Essentially, economics is how we use our resources, right? It's a very, very broad thing. It's not about money. It's not about financial or material things. How we use our financial material resources is, of course, part of it. But economics is much, much broader. It is about how we use our resources. How we use our resources to achieve certain goals. Some of these goals, again, may be material and financial, but not exclusively. The resources that we use are also symbolic ones. The network of relationships, including personal relationships that we move through in life. What we develop apart from our material successes or failures. All these things are part of economics. Economics is about making choices on how best to use our scarce resources. Material, of course, but also symbolic, in order to achieve certain ends, some of which are material, but some others are also symbolic. Some authors talk about psychic benefits. The Americans like to do that. It's a bit odd. Psychic in this context surprises me. But let's say symbolic as opposed to material, or as distinct, not as opposed, as distinct from material. It is simply part of what we do in economics, which is why economics is much bigger than the economy. The economy is what is normally tallied up in something like GDP, gross domestic product, for example, right? So the economy is one of the things that economics worries about, but economics is a way of looking at things. I'm fond of quoting a Nobel Prize winner there, that's Gary Becker, who got the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1992, and he said economics is defined not by its subject matter, but by its approach. Right? So economics is a way of looking at things, enables us to think about not just production, consumption, exchange, and markets, but also about the economics of the environment, the economics of health, the economics of education, the economics of language, and so on and so forth. And this is the perspective in which we have to, I believe, we have to think about the economics of language. Another important feature of language economics, having mentioned the centrality of decisions and choice at the very heart of economics, is a way of looking at the world, at a non-exclusive way, I should add, of looking at the world. I'll get back to this, is that there is a growing emphasis in language economics on application to language policies. Now, in economics, we can do lots of things. Since we can talk about pretty much anything that brings in the problem of resource scarcity, we could talk about, yes, about the environment, about health, etc. Coming to language, we could possibly talk about syntax and grammar. There are a few things you can do with economics about syntax and grammar, and some colleagues do this. Perhaps some of you have come across an extremely mathematically oriented and brainy book by Ariel Rubinstein, who's a prof in Tel Aviv. It's called Economics of Language, and it's about the structure of language seen from an economic perspective. I believe that this may not be, our strongest suit. We're not terribly good at talking about syntax, or phonology. However, I think we can be useful in combination with other disciplines when talking about the big choices that we make as societies regarding language and languages. So these are two important features, right? Back to the fundamentals of economics, and a focus on application through policies. In order to fix ideas, because I realize this may be a bit theoretical so far, let me give you a few examples of how the discipline has developed over time. And I told you it started in the 60s. Well, depending on who you read, they say, well, early 60s, late 60s, Depends. But I would say that phase one of the development of language economics is from the 60s and 80s. How did it start? It started as responses to actual policy and political problems. Socioeconomic questions, and here there are two important examples, important sort of sources, historical sources in language economics. One is Quebec in Canada, and the other one is the United States. In Quebec, as you know, which is a province that is about 82% French-speaking, it had been the case for a while that there were considerable earnings differentials, so labor income differentials, between people who had French and people who had English as a first language. So one question was, well, to what extent is this related to language proper? Or is it the result of other things? Is it the result of an uneven distribution of the ownership of firms? Is it a result of different levels of educational achievement in general? In order to single out, what came from where, economists were called in to assess what we know as earnings differentials. How do language skills or the language profiles of people, L1, L2, etc., how does this impact on people's earnings? So this was a very big push to the development of language economics, starting out from that very specific question, which has then helped to design language policies for Quebec primarily, and up to a certain degree for Canada, for the federal government as well. So this is one focus. The other one in the US is a slightly different one. Actually, it's quite a different one, because the idea in the US was to look at the impact of language not so much with respect to the official languages of the place, English, French in Quebec, etc., but to look at the language skills of immigrants and to assess the extent to which insufficient language skills in the dominant language of the US, namely English, could explain socioeconomic disadvantage. So you have a slightly different emphasis in these two lines of work. However, what they had in common was that the emphasis was on economic questions, right? The emphasis was, let us explain earnings differentials, let us explain socioeconomic status, and language may be the source of the explanation. If you want to put it in more technical terms, the economics were the dependent variable and the economics were the independent variable, all right? So as an independent variable, it was something exogenously brought in, so it was not the center of the attention. So this was the heart of language economics in this phase one of the discipline. In parallel with this, because econometrics or statistics is fine and well, but correlation is not causation, it doesn't explain anything, so you had to come up with more theoretical approaches. So there were some interesting theoretical models developed around the time to provide explanations in the form of cause and effect relationships of the processes that could be detected statistically. All kinds of a very interesting range of models developed at the time, some based on economic theories of discrimination, some based on information theory, some based on aspects of internal cost structures in firms. For those of you who've done international trade, you may remember something called optimum tariff theory. It's one of my nightmares, but it was a nightmare when I studied it. It is a nightmare when I have to teach it. It's gone out of fashion, thank God. Anyway, this has also been used in this case to explain what could be observed statistically. So that's phase one. Phase two, 80s and 90s. So what happened then? I think that's when it became, without relinquishing, without ditching what had been done before, it branched out into extremely interesting things. First of all, there was an application of the same econometric tools to foreign language skills, which brings us closer to the issues that we're going to be discussing here. So instead of looking at the lack of skills, for example, in the dominant language as a source of disadvantage, the idea was to start looking at the presence of skills, additional skills, special skills, in language 2 and L3, et cetera, as a source of advantage, as a profitable investment. So with all the possible link-ups with human capital theory. Right? Human capital theory has been oddly disinterested in language until a recent past. It's probably because in economics, we like to assume that what we do plugs into such deep forces in human behavior, that all the rest is epiphenomenal, is not really important, that language is not really important. So this is probably why it took people in human capital approaches such a long time to wise up to the fact that, hey, language exists, right? Perhaps one limitation of these things, however, is that you need a whole lot of data to do it. You need what I call RAD data. RAD is in radical, but RAD mostly, well, radically new data. R for representative, A for inadequate amounts. You can't do a study with 30 observations. You need a few hundred or thousands. And D, they need to be sufficiently detailed. If you have RAD data, then you can start into looking at those things. And not many countries have this. Canada does, thanks to their luxurious federal censuses. These people drive Rolls-Royces. Not many people do. In other countries, you have to rely on surveys, ad hoc surveys. And in Switzerland, we've been eking out a survey that we carried out 20 years ago. I'm currently begging for funds to renew it because, we can adjust the figures up to a point, but there comes a time where you have to do things anew, right? In a few other countries, they've done this partially, so you've got some data for places as diverse as Luxembourg, Israel, Ukraine, Australia up to a point, but it's sort of few and far between. However, there is strong convergence in the sort of results that you get, which is why I'm going to be using some of those in a moment. So that was one of the major developments in the 80s and 90s. The other thing that happened is that the received logic of language economics was turned around by giving language a much more central role. Remember what I said 2 minutes ago, that in the first phase, language was sort of, kind of an afterthought? Right. Now language in the 80s and 90s became much more central. What happened is that instead of looking at how language things could serve as an explanation for the really important economic processes, was turned around, is how can we use our understanding of economic processes to understand what happens to language, with the obvious implications for language policy. This has been used in particular at the time to develop and design more carefully various forms of language policy. So this has been applied, for example, to the study of language dynamics, models of language use by bilinguals, usually with an emphasis in places like Wales, Ireland, Basque Country, Catalonia. Also Quebec, of course. And generally, language use in multilingual settings. And this has, I think, ushered in many of the important developments in the economics of language policy. I think we're now in an ongoing phase 3, which is characterized by, first of all, greater interaction with other disciplines. So there is a lot of things very exciting happening now, in particular with experimental psychology. I'll get to this probably later. Social psychology and management. So new connections. Second thing is more attention to the sociolinguistic realities. This notion that we need to be interdisciplinary is progressively gaining converts in some of the more insular parts of economics. And finally, I think we're branching out into a wider range of policy issues. The new policy issues that emerge, that we're branching out into, emerge largely from the integration of questions that were until then considered in isolation from each other. In the European context, I don't know if you've been following some of the work that is being sponsored or encouraged by the European Commission. So there is a lot of things about language and mobility, multilingualism, mobility, social inclusion, social cohesion. So we've got a very complex social issues which are now being looked at increasingly through the angle of the role of multiple languages. Now, let me now move to the question of value. And the question of value is, of course, absolutely central. Value is what creates prosperity, or if you prefer more technically, value creation, value added if you wish, is at the root of prosperity. And we are often asked, as economists working on language, to answer questions that have to do with value, like how much is a small minority language worth? right? How much does an economy gain by operating in this instead of that language? And I will argue that we shouldn't think in terms of instead, right? What is the worth of foreign language skills? What is the value of multilingualism in general as opposed to the value of a given language in particular? You know, what is the general question as opposed to the specific question? So you've got lots of interesting things like this. I was recently in Australia, going back there next week actually, to work on the assessing the nature and the amount of resources that ought to be devoted to the protection and promotion of Pichan Chanchara, Yankun Chanchara. They usually find a way to pronounce this a bit faster. But how much should we devote to this? As part, in Australia, how much should they devote to this as part of a general language policy plan, as part of a general plan for the languages of Australia? So these are, sometimes very difficult questions to address, but they all revolve around the question of value. For a totally other level of questioning, but still about value is, well, how many official and working languages should we have? The European Union has 24 official and working languages, 4 sessions of the European Parliament, but it has only 1 for the Court of Justice, that's French, only 1 for the Central Bank, that's English, and 3 for the Commission, that's English, German, and French. So what is the worth, what is the value of doing this or that? So a very broad range of questions. Most of these questions are not terribly easy to answer. They're so complex that we need to parse the problem, and let me start with a very basic breakdown. When we talk about language and the value of language, very easy, not sufficient, but a good starting point is to make a difference between private value and social value on the one hand, and between market and non-market on the other hand. Market and non-market is something that I have alluded to a moment ago, right? When I said we don't only have material, financial, we also have symbolic or psychic, for those who like that term, right? This is essentially the same breakdown. A market value is something which you will be able to read off what happens on a market, right? Possibly a virtual market, or it can be reconstructed. Whereas the non-market values are generally the same thing as the symbolic values. For example, the direct enjoyment that you can derive if you speak, say, Bahasa Indonesia, the direct enjoyment that you can derive when you travel to Indonesia from direct contact with the inhabitants of the country, right? So that could be an example of a non-market value. Now, private and social, that's more technical and probably, in a sense, it's very important. Private is what accrues to an individual, or possibly stretching things a bit to a company, a firm, an individual decision maker, right? In economics, we look at the firm as one decision maker. So this would be one level at which you can read value and think in terms of how do languages impact on prosperity. Social means looking at society as a whole. The problem is that, as very often, the sum is not exactly the same as, the social, the aggregate, is not the same thing as the sum of the parts. There are situations where if you add the private values for individual people, it will end up giving you a good approximation of social value. It works if you look at the market for cars and tomatoes. It doesn't work if you think about computer systems or languages. Why? Because computer systems and languages function as networks. So moving from the individual to the aggregate is conceptually and technically more difficult, and to a large extent it is still unsolved nowadays. So we sort of know what we're talking about when we're assessing private market value. That's A, right? Cell A. But when we look at social non-market value, D, we're really on shaky ground. Research goes on about this, but there are bits that we know fairly well and bits that we do a lot of guesswork. So let's first look at what we know relatively well, and I'm going to be using a Swiss example here. I'm going to talk about cell A, right? So private market value, essentially the rates of return on language skills, which is the heart of private market value. So here are those data. And as you know, in Switzerland, we've got four national languages, 3.5 official. They are in very sharply separated language regions. French in the west, Geneva, for example, where I come from, German in the north, center, and east, and Italian in the south. I'm leaving out, for now, the Romansh-speaking area, which makes up a very, very small percentage of the population. And here we've looked at the rate of return on language skills for people in these different language regions. But looking at French as a second or third language, German as a second or third language, French and German, which are national languages, and then English, which is not a national language, but a widely taught one, in the English and German-speaking regions. Also in the Italian one, except in the Italian, you've got two little dots in the lower right-hand corner of this table because the results were not statistically significant. Now, what do we see? If we compare people who have similar education, a similar number of years of work experience, which are two very, very central determinants of earnings, we find that in the French-speaking region, where I'm from, having a level of English and German roughly around a B2, right? I'm not going to go into the underlying levels there. Having a B2 in German or English will yield, respectively, a wage premium of 13.8% or 10.2%. Obviously, learning languages is a very good investment, right? It is something that pays off. So this is why I do encourage people in general to say, well, if you're going to be spending money on something, do learn languages in the plural, right? Now, in the German-speaking region, the rates of return are even higher, 14.1% for French, which is remarkably symmetric to the 13.8 for German in the French-speaking region, right? And much higher for English at 18.1. So there again, I say invest in languages, right? In this case, English brings in more than French, but the 14.1% for French is not to be sneezed at. There are not many investments that will generate a similar rate of return, in real terms, right? Net of inflation. In the Italian-speaking region, because it is a very, very minority community in the country, it is kind of unsurprising that the rates of return are tendentially even higher. These rates of return are for men. We also have rates of return for women. They are a little bit unstable for statistical reasons. The reason is that if you want to compute these rates of return, you have to have a pretty good notion of how many years of experience a person has. It is part of the controls that you use to make the estimation, right? Now, in the case of women, it is very difficult to know unless you go and pry into very private information. How long or when or did you interrupt your career for, family, children, etc. Because it is very difficult to get that information, we usually do not collect them, or if we do, it's only partial, and the result is that the estimations for women tend to be less stable than for men. This is why here you have the results for men, and we don't have the time to go into this, but they are extremely robust, i.e. you can shake it, as we say, by putting in other variables, turning it on its, any way you want, you still end up with those very stable, very strong rates of return, confirming that investing in language is a good thing. From the standpoint of the individual, these are private rates of return. But now, how do we get there? We get there also because the state or society invests money into this. So what you can do is modify this analysis, bring in the value, the amounts spent or invested into language education, and then you assess the rates of return again. And you get to what is known as the social rates of return, which you have here, for the same regions and the same languages. The interesting thing about those social rates of return is that because of the way in which they are constructed, they are directly comparable to the rates of return on the stock market. So now, does anybody have a banker who offers similar rates of return risk-free? Please raise your hand. if anybody had that, I'd say, well, please introduce me to your banker. Because this is, there is simply nothing nowadays that offers remotely comparable rates of return, right? And this, again, risk-free for the midterm. Long-term is something different. We'll get to it. But then every euro, peso, franc, pound invested in teaching, say German, for example, has a return of 6.5% in the French-speaking region and 11.7% in the Italian-speaking region, if we take the middle column. Rates of return on English are a bit more spread out, slightly lower in the French-speaking region. Why so? Because as we have seen before, German being the majority language of Switzerland is particularly valuable and paradoxically particularly scarce. Which means the rates of return on German are particularly high. By comparison, those, because of the amount devoted to English, these suffer a little bit. In the case of the German-speaking region, I know the rates of return on the teaching of English is again, considerable, 12.6%. So there again, investing in language is very profitable for individuals, very profitable for collectivities or for states, nations, countries, whatever, as well. Right, so on this basis, we can also try to, broaden the argument and think in macroeconomic terms. And here we would think in terms of aggregate value added, in terms of GDP, if you want. So far we have thought in terms of, percentage of extra income or percentage or rate of return on an investment. But what is the value of multilingualism in macroeconomic terms? So to do this, you have to, well, it's a more complicated technical approach. Essentially, what you have to do is think of language skills as a production factor. Those of you who remember their economics may recall we have, only talk about capital and labor, and that's it, right? But what you can do is techniques for that. You extract the language skills from the labor, and you think in terms of capital, labor net of L2, L3 skills, and L2, L3 skills, right? So you break it up in a slightly different way, and then you run estimations and simulations of the that enable you to assess the contribution of skills to GDP. So we've done this for Switzerland, and we've imagined, well, what would happen if some sort of evil, mysterious alien ray were to, sweep over the country at night so that the next morning everybody wakes up monolingual, otherwise unchanged, but monolingual. The drop in GDP would be about 10%, 9.5. It's again, the procedure will yield things that will oscillate between 8 and 12, more or less, right? In 2009, that would mean about 50 billion Swiss francs, or 42 billion euros. Similar calculations for Quebec, because the data were available, and suggested a drop in the region of 3 to 4%, which makes sense, because in Quebec, French is the main language, and there is only another important language, mostly English, even if the role of Spanish is growing thanks to the NAFTA, which brings in Mexico. But in the case of Switzerland, the range of languages that we have to use in everyday economic life is more important, which means, therefore, the drop in GDP that would result from linguistic amnesia would be more severe. There are other quantitative results about all kinds of things. We don't have the time to talk about this. I just thought that I would mention that we can look at the impact of language skills on access to employment, on the likelihood to remain employed. That's an interesting and fairly fresh result. When wages go up, typically firms will try to reduce staff costs, so they lay people off. They will lay bilinguals off at a much lower rate than unilinguals. So there's a very, pretty strong result there. There are also things about firms' needs, some met, some unmet in terms of foreign language skills. There is a novel streak of research about the country-level trade effects of sharing a common language with trading partners, a language that others do not have. So what is the privilege that, the advantages that Chile gets from being able to trade more directly with other Spanish-speaking countries. This has been done also, for example, in Francophonie. What are the advantages in terms of openness to trade and, by way of consequence, GDP growth. There is also something on the impact of linguistic diversity or fragmentation, if you want to see it negatively, on per capita GDP in developing countries, and we'll talk about this in a moment because I think that's pretty central. And then there is something about costs of language policies. Before we move on, I realized that I thought I had plenty of time, but not so much. Let's remember that when thinking about value, it's important to distinguish two questions, yet know that ultimately it's hard to separate them. The value of one language is one level of the question. The value of multilingualism is another level of the question. Multilingualism is made up of languages, right? Each language is a component of multilingualism, and this is where there is a very complex connection between the two levels of analysis. The whole notion of value is one that is sensitive to one additional specification: value for whom? Are we talking, we've talked about the value for the individual, we've talked about the value for society as a whole, but then we could also think about the value for companies, or the value for what is conventionally known as the economy. So there are lots of different things. You can also break it up by social class. The results are not necessarily going to be the same depending on what social class you focus on. So lots of things that we still need to consider. And then most importantly, I think there is the contingent versus absolute level of analysis. That's one thing that matters. When we talk about the value of one language or the value of multilingualism, we can think of it in what I call contingent terms, i.e., we can say, well, we now live in a situation, a contingency, if you want, which is that the world is multilingual. Given this existing linguistic diversity, what is the best response? What do we do? What languages do we teach? How far? To whom? To what level of competence? At what time? At what age? Right? And another question is the absolute level of analysis, which is, well, what is the value of multilingualism as opposed to uniformity? It is a completely different question. They are not unrelated, but it is important to distinguish between the two because answering one does not necessarily answer the other, right? If you answer that in a contingent world where there are many languages, multilingualism or skills in English or French or Spanish or Chinese are valuable, that's one thing. But in a world that is, dependent on the fact that these languages are used and spoken. A completely different thing again is, well, should the world become unilingual? What would be the advantages and what would be the drawbacks? I will argue that there are more drawbacks to advantages. But it is a different type of question and slightly different instruments. So I was telling you about 4 levels of value. In fact, if you combine various analytical dimensions, you easily end up with 64 types of value. Not all of them are worth investigating. Some are, I guess, more relevant than others, but there is a lot of work to be done. And my appeal now is for those of you who can do so, please tell your graduate students. I'm trying to recruit people right now. I have a real hard time finding people who, whom I can sort of engage and say, well, do your PhD in this. There are tons of things to be done. So I think there are a massive range of interesting questions out there. Is English special? Well, yes, English generates high returns as a foreign language, or as a second, potentially becoming first language for immigrants when they move to a predominantly English-speaking country. That's the gist of the numerical results I showed you before. It applies to English, but it also applies to German in Germany for Turkish immigrants. And the value of foreign language skills is not confined to English, as we have seen. It is also German. Whenever we have data in RAD data, we find important high rates of return to a wide range of languages. Note, by the way, that the needs for language skills that to a large extent determine these rates of return, these needs differ enormously depending on the type of activity. They are also often misinterpreted. They are quite often overestimated. This is one of the cliches that I talked about before. There is this general idea that one language dominates all. Well, of course, but then these things change, and then as one language becomes more widespread, it becomes more banal. As it becomes more banal, the rates of return go down, right? And it is usually the rates of return on other skills that are increasingly making the difference between more or less financial success. So what I would suggest is, yes, of course, do learn and teach English, but don't stop there. Have one or two more up your sleeve. And if you're lucky enough to have something like Spanish, which is a major world language, remember that Spanish is something that is equally important for economic success, in particular when it comes to the choice of languages to use in higher education, teaching, and research. It is very important, I believe, for long-term prosperity to think in terms of a multilingual educational world, particularly at tertiary level. So, fine, broaden the range of languages, don't restrict it. So in developing economies, there is a very common, frequently mentioned notion that fragmentation is bad and that the use of a dominant language is profitable. Or, conversely, that linguistic concentration on English, but, or French or Spanish, would yield to a higher GDP per capita. This is, however, demonstrably a spurious correlation. We just published this in a book called English and Development, by the way, with a colleague of mine in development economics, because what happens, in fact, is that both variables are influenced by other variables, typically unobserved. So the relationship between linguistic concentration, again, whether it's English or French or Spanish makes no difference, and GDP per capita does not hold. And whenever there is a significant relationship, it is actually linguistic diversity that has a positive impact on GDP per capita. There is very often very careless work on this. There is a pretty egregious example, a very recent one, on the Harvard Business Review blog network. This is an example of what not to do. And if you look at the blog, the forum underneath that rather calamitous piece, you will find that most of the people reacting say, hey, well, thanks for such a bad piece, because it helps me to teach my students the difference between correlation and causation. So if we look at the bigger picture, over time there is probably going to be an erosion of the rate of return to the languages that become banalized. Right now, English is undergoing banalization, which means it's useful to have English. It is, I believe, necessary. I encourage people to use it, not to mention, my own intense pleasure as using a language that has such a rich literature and offers me access to, that's a non-material benefit, by the way, a symbolic one, offers me access to a wide range of English-speaking cultures. I do not consider, however, that English is what gives me access to Chile. Spanish is what gives me access to Chile. Perhaps Spanish and Mapuche, I don't know. But the role of English to me is to give me access to the enormous riches of English medium cultures and literatures, which I tremendously enjoy. Having said that, remember that because more people are learning it, so increasing the supply of English language skills, this will probably outstrip the demand for skills in English, and as a consequence, the rate of return on English tendentially can go down. In the same way, if you want, as literacy. Think about literacy. There was a time when being able to say, hey, I can read, I can write, would be the key to success. Now, if you go to an employer and say, hey, I can read, I can write, and say, well, nice, what else do you know? Right? So I think for English, there is a range of jobs where I think this is going to happen. I do not for 1 second believe what we heard this morning, that 75%, I think, of jobs in Chile will require English by 2020. In 6.5 years? No, absolutely not. Put money on it if you want. Certainly not. I think, however, there is a large number of situations where English is going to be useful, and I encourage the learning of it, But I think it is not, one should not assume that this in and of itself is what makes a career. It helps, but what makes a career is additional things. In terms of scope, let me stress again that any linguistic hegemony, and no matter if the hegemon is English, Spanish, French, Marathi, Putonghua, it doesn't matter. I think this also, and this brings us to the absolute level that I was alluding to, this carries risks unless we say that cultural diversity has no value at all. Language and culture being correlated, if we value cultural diversity, it follows that linguistic diversity is something that we should also focus on. And again, let me repeat, I never repeat this enough, let me repeat one more time. It doesn't matter if it is English or French or Spanish or whatever else in the dominant position. It is a linguistic domination in and of itself, which I think is potentially problematic. Also because all kinds of circumstantial evidence suggests that linguistic uniformity is detrimental to creativity and innovation. Where there is some research that has been done, sponsored by the European Union recently. We are right now just about to embark on another pretty huge project under Framework Program 7. It's for the closing of Framework Program 7 of the European Commission, part of which will be devoted precisely to that, precisely to the role of linguistic diversity in the individual or in work teams as a condition for creativity and innovation. So this is why, and in passing, 1 minute, English as a lingua franca, aka ELF. English as a lingua franca is, as you know, something that has been put forward by some esteemed colleagues. They say that English, to all intents and purposes, is in fact no longer English at all, but something deeply different called English as a lingua franca. And because I'm a non-native speaker of English, I'm not talking English to you right now. Mark my words, I'm talking ELF, right? The interesting thing about ELF is the syllogistic nature of the whole enterprise. How does it come about? The idea is that, okay, we'll grant you that the spread of one language, in this case English, can be dangerous for linguistic diversity, or it can be imperialistic, or this or that. Proposition 1. Proposition 2 is, ELF is not English. Proposition 3, end of the syllogism, therefore, the spread of ELF is not dangerous for diversity, for whatever, etc., etc. It is a syllogism of the lowest order. Nevertheless, it is immensely successful. So if you look at what ELF is, when you ask people, say, well, please define what ELF is, then they get into constant contradictions, endless logical tangles, because if I, as a non-native speaker, speak English to a native speaker of English, and they answer back to me, what language is this conversation, what language are we using? Perhaps we're using two different languages, or, well, there are lots of extremely juicy quotes that I'd be delighted to share with you at some point about, some of the things that the ELF people say, but we don't have the time for that. Anyway, so let's not be fooled by that. That's a complete, what exists is English, for better or for worse. I think for better, if it is part of a general vision of a multilingual world, but let's not waste time about something called ELF. What exists, if you prefer, is lingua franca English. That's completely different, but not English as lingua franca. So, on balance, foreign language skills are profitable for individuals. In English, as in other languages, let's not forget them. I think they're a profitable investment for society, but the issue there is not English, I believe, versus this or that language. It's not English per se. Or, if it were the case, it's not French per se, or Putonghua per se. It is uniformity versus diversity. I think whether you take this in contingent or absolute terms, this is where the real debate is, and it is, I think, one of the major challenges of the 21st century. I think that prosperity results from multilingualism, not from this language or that language. If we look at other aspects, the symbolic values, we can look into those a bit more deeply. If we also bring in another aspect that I have deliberately left aside, namely resource distribution as opposed to resource allocation, this only reinforces my conclusions. Perhaps we can talk about this later during the roundtable, the podium discussion, or roundtable discussion if you want. No time for this now. My conclusion is simply that, again, we need to broaden the scope of the forum. from English for prosperity to multilingualism for prosperity. And I will now thank you in the 4 national languages of my little country, much, much smaller than Chile. Grazie, Fici.